Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd just like to respond first to a couple of issues that were just raised in the Q&A there. Number one, in response to the question about Canada immediately bringing refugees, we're doing exactly what the UN High Commissioner of Refugees has asked us to do. There is actually an international consensus that during a crisis, you don't immediately evacuate people to other nations on a permanent basis. It is the hope. No, you don't. That's actually, I'm sure the member will check and find that is the international convention. And it's for the simple reason we all hope they'll be able to go back to a normalized nation and give them the choice of where they'd like to live. And for many of them, the majority, we would presume, would like to go back to their homes in their own country in a stable, secure Syria. And secondly, the member mentioned the crisis in Lebanon. Many of the people that Canada flew out of Lebanon and were actually Canadian citizens with dual citizenship. And the other point that I'd just like to respond to was, in fact, the point raised about the minister's comments, saying that there is a need for more action and we will do more. What the minister actually said, so I was listening to that debate, was as time goes on, we will do more as opportunity becomes available in concert with our international partners. Because Canada's done more than almost any other nation at this juncture in providing aid to refugees, and we will continue to do so, as the minister said. Mr. Speaker, I will be sharing my time with the member from Richmond Hill. And I'd like to commence by saying, with nearly every passing day, more shocking reports emerge from the atrocities committed against the Syrian people by the ruthless regime of Bashar al-Assad. The horrific toll of this conflict on the Syrian population is staggering, and to date, it's estimated by the UN that 80,000 people have been killed. More than 4.25 million have been internally displaced by the violence. And Mr. Speaker, in terms of refugees, we estimate 1.4, possibly as many as 1.5 million people are currently refugees from the conflict in Syria. They're in Jordan, they're in Lebanon, they're in Turkey, some are in Egypt, and some are in Iraq. And according to the UN High Commission, they're registering as many as 7,000 refugees a day. And I think we heard the minister say earlier in Jordan, it's as many as 2,000 a day arriving in Jordan. This is a humanitarian crisis on a huge scale. Reports on the ground detail a litany of horrific human rights abuses committed by the Syrian regime. Tragically, with the conflict now in its third year, the human rights and humanitarian situation in the country continues to deteriorate. The UN Commission of Inquiry on Syria has now issued several reports documenting widespread, systemic, and gross human rights violations by Syrian security forces, including arbitrary arrest, detention, sexual violence, pillaging, destroying of cultural and other protected properties. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure our government, I'm sure all Canadians, continue to be deeply concerned with ongoing reports of sectarian violence, which has been exacerbated by the crisis in Syria. Upon their liberation from Assad's iron fist, the Syrian people must not find themselves threatened by those who seek to impose a new type of tyranny, or those who threaten the security and stability of Syria's neighbors. Our government has for some time been speaking up for religious minorities in Syria, and most recently on May 4th, following a deeply troubling incident of violence in the coastal city of Banyas, Canada's new ambassador for religious freedom, Andrew Bennett, condemned the violence and he urged respect for religious minorities. The Syrian people have a strong culture of pluralism, acceptance, and coexistence that's at odds with recent attacks singling out individual groups. There's another troubling incident. Recently, Metropolitan Paul Yazigi of the Antiochian Orthodox Archdiocese and Mar Gregorius Johanna Ibrahim of the Syriac Archdiocese, both of Aleppo, were abducted while returning to Syria from Turkey, where they've been doing humanitarian work. Once again, on April the 25th, our government spoke out against these events and called for the immediate release of their eminences. Mr. Speaker, sadly, even women and children are not safe from the violence. There are deeply troubling reports from Syria consistently suggesting that sexual violence has become prevalent both on an opportunistic basis and as a deliberate method of warfare. And while the full extent of this is difficult to ascertain, The United Nations and NGOs on the ground indicate that it is widespread. There have also been disturbing reports of displaced women being abducted, trafficking of women, as well as girls, well documented. Mr. Speaker, the Assad regime has indiscriminately killed and injured great numbers of civilians through the use of heavy weapons in populated areas. It's launched Scud missiles at the northern rebel-held cities in Syria with no apparent effort to distinguish between civilian and legitimate military targets. And there's credible reporting that suggests that the Assad regime has used cluster munitions as a weapon of war against its own citizens, include dropping bombs indiscriminately from attack helicopters on densely populated urban areas. More recently, we've heard reports on the alleged use of chemical weapons in Syria. The UN has established a fact-finding mission to establish whether such weapons have been used and by whom. Canada has contributed some $2 million to these efforts. Unfortunately, I suppose we could say unsurprisingly, the Syrian regime and authorities have yet to grant the mission permission to visit and begin its investigation. I think we heard the minister say earlier that if chemical weapons have been used, it will be important to determine who they were used by, and if they were used, it'll be important to determine when they were used, and as we said, by whom, because that will be essential in holding the perpetrators to account. If there are conflicting reports, whether it's the regime or the rebels that have used chemical weapons, but in either case, the use of chemical weapons is a huge escalation, and all of our international partners are duly alarmed by this escalation and determined to hold the perpetrators to account. Ultimately, Assad and his supporters, if they're the culpable, will be held accountable. Mr. Speaker, Canada's objectives in Syria support a transition to a stable, to a democratic, a pluralistic post-Assad time while addressing the urgent humanitarian needs of those affected by the crisis. Through this difficult and violent period, one that's claimed the lives of far too many innocent civilians, we remain committed to a democratic transition in Syria. Canada will continue to express the need for respect and promotion of human rights, particularly for religious minorities. It's vitally important that all Syrians can contribute to development without fear of violence, and it's our hope, in fact, it's our belief, that the regime's strategy of ruthless repression will not succeed in crushing the spirit of the Syrian people. We are all hopeful that out of this terrible carnage and devastation will emerge a better future for the suffering people of Syria. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I look forward to questions from my colleagues.
Excellent. Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The honourable member for Toronto Centre.
Mr. Speaker, in terms of the early exchange that the member for Nanaimo Alberni had with the member for Navarre, I wonder if the member would not agree with me that there's a difference between refugee claims and treating refugees and dealing with the refugee issue and accelerating Canada's dealing with the immigration claims of those people who are seeking reconciliation with their families. What we've been arguing for is a clear policy in the office in Beirut, as well as the office in Amman, that will allow those offices to deal on an accelerated basis with people who wish to be reconciled with their families in Canada, and to make sure that those claims are dealt with on an expedited basis because they're living in a refugee camp. I hope the member would understand there's a difference between what we're asking for and what he's saying in terms of the broad issue of resettling all the refugees. I think everyone agrees that you don't resettle all the refugees until you can figure out whether there's a political solution available in Syria. But that's different from the people who have a connection with Canada and with Canadians and whose claims are not being treated right now on an expedited basis.
Member for Nanaimo Alberni.
Well, I thank the member for Toronto Centre for his question, and again, I would thank him for bringing this subject to the floor of the House of Commons today so we could all take part in a debate. But I think the member knows full well, and I think even the way he framed his question would indicate that he's well aware there are international norms and conventions on managing a refugee crisis situation. That, in fact, whether there are family members in Canada or not, if they're in the refugee, if they were applying for Canadian citizenship and in the queue already, there might be certainly accelerated claims for a small number of those cases might in fact be reasonable. But I think in fact the international norms require, and there are very sound reasons that the UN High Commission and other responsible, our partners have come to the conclusion that in a humanitarian crisis, it's not the first objective to take people out of the conflict zone and depopulate Syria to other countries, because it creates a whole different dynamic that actually is not helpful to the long-term solution in the area and the betterment of refugee situations around the world.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the honourable member for Newton North Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague across the aisle for the speech he made. This is an area that all of us share a concern about, what's happening in Syria. The question I have for him is that we have quite a large diaspora from Syria, and many of them, I know they come into my office and our constituency office, and I've heard from other MPs, the ones who are coming in, who have family members who do qualify under our immigration system for family reunification. What could his government be doing at this time to speed up family reunification and helping out both the Canadian families here and those who are suffering over there?
The honourable member for Nanaimo, Alberni.
Well, again, I thank the member who's also from the West Coast, from Newton North Delta, for her question. I think that the fact that Canadians who have family members caught in that conflict is quite understandable. They would be very, very anxious for the well-being of their relatives. We've heard, the conditions in the camp, they're out of the conflict zone, but living in a refugee camp, no matter how well they may be provided for, is not a normal situation for families. We heard examples from children. The minister gave an example of I think it was a 7-year-old child being asked, and her response was, "I don't like it here, I want to go home." That's a very normal thing. I think in spite of that, there are international norms that should be respected in the situation. I think probably the government is probably looking at what might be done to accelerate those who have family situations there, and there may be cases for some assistance, but I think that the majority are going to, we're going to hope for a quick resolution to the crisis there so that we can move towards normalization and populations can be dealt with as the crisis abates and a more normal situation emerges.